Back to Diggy Gaming. Today we're looking at part 2 of Gladiators of World War II, the ANZACS. Pretty good series so far. Not much else to say other than socials will be down below, as well as the original video. What else? Haven't earned your subscribe yet, please hit that so I can start doing some more stuff, and hit the like button too. Thanks guys, let's start this part 2. Alright, so it's a little bit before where we stopped, but we'll start again anyway. Let's go.
Among the heroes of the campaign was Australian artilleryman Lieutenant Arthur Roden Cutler, who lost a leg during heavy fighting. For several individual acts of bravery, he won a VC. Despite the eventual Allied success in Syria, the siege of Tobruk remained the main focus
I
of...
still can't believe that's the thing today, making you shave out in the middle of a war. Pain in the ass.
Even though the rats of Tobruk showed no sign of cracking under the strain, the Australian government was becoming concerned that its troops were bearing too great a burden of the fighting.
Yeah, and after some things like Gallipoli, that's understandable.
General Sir Claude Auchinleck, the Commander-in-Chief Middle East, was obliged to begin replacing the garrison. In August 1941, the Australian 18th Brigade was relieved by the Free Polish Carpathian Brigade. The relief continued into the autumn, but one Australian battalion would remain in Tobruk until the very end.
Yeah.
Auchinleck was also preparing an offensive designed to drive Rommel back and relieve Tobruk. He launched Operation Crusader on the 18th of November. The New Zealand Division, supported by a British tank brigade, was given the crucial role of linking up with the Tobruk garrison, which had been given orders to break out. The New Zealanders faced stubborn Axis resistance. But after 8 days fighting, they linked up with some of the troops from Tobruk at El Duda, 20 miles southeast of them.
Some Rios.
The New Zealanders now had to withstand a series of furious attacks designed to drive them away from Tobruk. Eventually, the division was cut in two by 15th Panzer Division and forced to withdraw, but not before it had made a significant contribution to wearing down the Axis forces. Within a week, Rommel had withdrawn from Tobruk, and by early January, the British were once more in control of Cyrenaica, having inflicted heavy casualties on the Axis forces. But by this time there had been developments elsewhere, which were to have a dramatic effect on the future of the Australian and New Zealand forces in the Middle East. On the 7th of December 1941, the war came closer to the ANZACS homelands as Japanese carrier-borne aircraft made a surprise attack on the US Pacific Fleet base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. This finally brought the United States into the war, much to the relief of the British.
Much to the relief of Australia too. Got to a point where the UK literally had to say, sorry, but we've got to go defend our own homeland from attack. And Australia put upwards of 1 million soldiers into the Pacific Islands. But luckily we got some American help. So.
But the conflict now took a grim turn for the Allies. For the Japanese launched immediate invasions of Malaya and the Philippines, as well as US Pacific Islands. Now that the war had suddenly reached their doorsteps, the Australian and New Zealand governments requested the return of their troops from the Middle East. It was the Japanese invasion of Malaya which especially worried Australia. And this concern grew rapidly as the Japanese advanced swiftly down the peninsula. A complete Australian division, the 8th, had been deployed to Malaya earlier in the year, clearly showing how important the territory was reckoned to be for the defence of the Australian homeland.
What a difference in kit now compared to now.
2 Indian divisions covered northern Malaya, while the Australians, under General Henry Gordon Bennett, were responsible for the south. The Japanese were soon driving the Indian troops back. The British High Command had no answer to their use of outflanking moves through the jungle. By mid-January, Gordon Bennett's men were in action, but could not stop the Japanese onrush.
Lewis gun.
At the end of the month, the British forces withdrew to Singapore Island.
This didn't go well.
2 weeks later, it was all over. The British and Dominion troops were forced into an...
Look at the height difference between the Japanese and the Aussies and the Poms.
ignominious surrender. The vast majority of the Australians, together with their fellow British and Indian soldiers, went into captivity. They now faced over 3.5 years of Japanese brutality.
You ever looking for a good TV series about what happened to the Australians in prisoner of war camps? I think it's called Changi, after the POW base. Yeah, good show.
But one man who did escape was General Gordon Bennett, who believed that his experience in fighting the Japanese would be of value in the future. His fellow countrymen thought differently, believing that he should have gone into captivity with his men. Gordon Bennett never held another active command. The fall of Singapore presented a direct Japanese threat to Australia, and this was reinforced by an air attack on Darwin on the 19th of February 1942, 4 days after the surrender of Singapore. The fear that Australia was about to be invaded grew rapidly, and the government renewed...
There's something a lot of people don't know is the first bombing of Darwin, there was more bombs dropped on Darwin than there was at Pearl Harbor. And there was up to... Someone correct me, but I believe there was up to like 30, 50 bombings of Australia. So they were right at our doorstep.
its request for the troops in the Middle East to be sent back. The 6th and 7th Australian Divisions returned in March. Their families were overjoyed to see them again, but it would not be long before they were parted once more.
Sorry for the yawn.
The 9th Australian and the New Zealand divisions remained in the Middle East, but only because the Americans had agreed to send troops to Australia.
Yeah.
These began to arrive in April 1942. A detachment of 7th Australian Division was immediately sent to Java in the Dutch East.
So at the time, Australia actually owned, I think they still owned part of Papua New Guinea. we had people in Timor back then, Borneo, Java, yeah. So we didn't hold a lot of ground.
East Indies, but the Japanese onrush overwhelmed it and other Allied forces in the region. Many Australians refused to surrender, and with the help of the local people began to wage a guerrilla campaign against the Japanese occupiers.
Yeah, so a quick story. When I was over in East Timor for peacekeeping operations, we actually had some guys fly over that were there in World War II, and they told us that when they lost comms, they thought that the war had been won by the Japanese, and they decided to keep fighting without any word from the mainland. Pretty crazy guys. One of their ships was sunk, and cooks and all sorts of non-combat corps people suddenly become special forces commandos in guerrilla warfare. So, yeah, it's crazy. Thompson.
The focus of the Japanese assault now switched to New Guinea, with landings being made at Lae.
Solomon Islands too, I was also stationed there for a while, and you can still see a lot of the islands littered with UXOs from World War II. There's that many bombs there still, and barbed wire, and dug-in trenches and all sorts. It's pretty crazy to see.
And Salamaua in early March 1942. These were accompanied by air attacks on Port Moresby on the southwest coast, and further bombing raids against Darwin. At the end of March, the Australian government began a total denial policy in the northern part of the country. Nothing of value was to be allowed to fall into Japanese hands, should they invade, and a vast migration of sheep and cattle was got underway.
Yeah, so they'll probably explain it here, but they had a fallback plan of the Brisbane line, so anything north of Brisbane would be considered probably Japanese-held territory, and they would mount their offence or defence from that line. Pretty crazy to think that it got that close.
American General Douglas MacArthur, who had been ordered by President Roosevelt to leave the beleaguered Philippines, arrived in Australia and became the Supreme Allied Commander, Southwest Pacific. Australian General Thomas Blamey was appointed the Land Force Commander.
Blamey Barracks, another barracks named after an old general.
The ultimate Japanese objective in Papua New Guinea was the capital Port Moresby, which they planned to seize by an amphibious assault. But this meant that they must bring back their carriers, which had been sent to the Indian Ocean to harry the British. While these were returning, the Japanese continued to occupy the western part of the island, while their Port Moresby invasion force sailed from Rabaul in New Britain on the 4th of May 1942. Forewarned of this by their codebreakers, the United States sent a carrier force to intercept the Japanese in the Coral Sea. In the ensuing battle, the Americans had a carrier disabled, while the Japanese lost one carrier sunk and another crippled. It was enough to force the Japanese to cancel the amphibious attack on Port Moresby. But still determined to capture it, they decided on an overland advance along the Kokoda Trail, which cuts through the precipitous Owen Stanley Mountains from Boona on the north coast.
That's something that I want to do one day. It's like a bit of a rite of passage for Australians, and Australian soldiers specifically is the Kokoda track. It's pretty arduous. Yeah. So one day, hopefully I'll get there and I'll vlog it for you.
The only forces facing them were a partially trained Australian militia battalion and some local Papuan troops.
Right, so I might stop it there and make it into 3 parts. But yeah, the people that were there were militia units, so reserve units. It's always a good callback when someone calls you bloody reservist or something. You just say, yeah, just held down Kokoda and stuff like that. But I'm sure the video will go on to tell, but they were replaced by the units from North Africa that didn't have the right gear at all, but they still managed to push them back. But we'll come across that in the next episode. Thanks for watching, guys, and see you next time. Don't forget to subscribe. Cheers.